Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, and I am here to discuss fasting and marriage and fasting um, how fasting benefits marriage, and also kind of a connection there that a lot of you may not have considered before. So before I get too far into it, I want to really quickly remind everybody that if you're in a financial position to do so and you like what we're doing here at Freed Indeed, please head on down to the link in the description below and consider becoming a member, where you'll gain access to some member exclusives, and you'll also be making possible what we're doing for as little as $1 a month. You can make a huge difference through Freed Indeed Ministries. I also want to share with you guys another ministry. Hold on one second. Oh, excuse me. Excuse me. Huh, tis the season, am I right? Tis the season. Um anyway, so the ministry I want to tell you about today is called Share the Faith. Head over to sharethefaith.net and you'll see the great work that they're doing, and you'll also see how you can help. So definitely check that out. They help missionary priests, particularly in the US and Canada, to receive um, full time support and be able to conduct full time pastoral ministry, which is something that a lot of mission parishes are not able to provide for their priests. And we have need of more priests, not less, and more missions, not less. We want to reach the whole world, including the US and Canada. From an Orthodox perspective, the US and Canada are both still to this day essentially unreached territories in need of evangelizing. So we need to um, be active in this and be active in the conversion of the English speaking world, but also we want to be active in the conversion of all people. So definitely, this is something that I'm very passionate about. Now, without further ado, let's get into our um, main topic today. So, our main topic the is fasting and marriage. So, fasting, I'm getting this from Seraphim of Sarov, who was a great Russian theologian. And Seraphim of Sarov, he would, whenever a young woman came to him and said she was having difficulty deciding who to marry or finding a husband who she could marry, Saint Seraphim of Sarov would always um, instruct these women to choose a husband who fasts. Now, we might think, well, why wouldn't he say choose a husband who loves? And obviously, loving your spouse is important. But the reason why he says fasting is because loving is something that is more difficult to discern readily. It's something that takes time, whereas you can tell whether someone fasts or doesn't. You can see that. That's something you can ask them directly. Do you keep the fasts? And if they say no, you know that they do not. So we're going to talk about what Seraphim of Sarov is getting at, and especially within the context of marriage and preparing for marriage. So again, I already mentioned you can support Freed Indeed Ministries in the link in the description below. I also have a link to Share the Faith Ministry, sharethefaith.net, so you can check out what they're doing. I also want to give a shout out to Seraphim Hamilton, formerly known as Cabane the Christian. The reason why I'm giving a shout out to him is because his lesson on fasting is really, really awesome. And in it, he mentioned fasting with its relationship to marriage, but he didn't go into it. So I'll be drawing on some of what he said, and I would encourage you to watch his video. It's really excellent. It's not a very long one, it's only like 11 minutes. So go ahead and check that out. And he gives just a great explanation of why the Orthodox Church recommends people fast in general, why fasting is a category in the church. And so it's very helpful. Now, um, getting more to the brass tacks, the topic, you know, again, this arises from the question, how can I find a spouse? And that's a very, very common question. It's a good question to be for young people to be asking. And when that question is posed to people like myself, we often respond by saying, become the person your prospective spouse will need you to be. And that's how you should be searching for, that's what you should be doing to help you find the right person, is you find that person by making the necessary changes and the necessary um doing that within yourself, making the necessary developments within yourself. And so fasting is one of the practical examples we can offer of how to do that, because I think a lot of times people ask this question very sincerely. It's a great question to ask. And then they get a response like that, become the person your prospective spouse will need you to be. And then they don't know how to do that. They don't know what that really means. I mean, part of it means reading marriage books, part of it means fast. So, um, so think about it this way. The As Cabane says, or Seraphim Hamilton says, the mechanism by which we eat is also the mechanism by which we speak. And the mechanism by which we control what we eat is the will, which is the same mechanism by which we bridle the tongue. So just as the mechanism, the oral part of our body, is the mechanism by which we eat, so too the mechanism, and so too the mechanism by which we speak. Also, the mechanism by which we control speech is the mechanism by which we control the will. Now, understand that God didn't have to make our bodies in this way, He did, so it behooves us to think about it. So, this is why the purpose of fasting helps us to train the will, not just for speech, although within the context of marriage, speech is kind of a big deal. You know, speech is the same. You can Our words have the power to destroy or to build up. Our words have the power to bless people or to curse them. And because of that, it's important to train our minds, to train our wills, and to train our speech, because within the context of marriage, whether you build up or whether you tear down over time becomes whether the marriage is happy or difficult. Um, and that's just one example. We're going to be going through quite a bit more. So first of all, our will is either the greatest ally or the greatest enemy in fighting sin. Right now I'm talking about the training of the will as part of why we fast. We fast to train the will. Um, we need to understand that the body itself is not sinful. We don't fast because we're trying to deprive the body because the body is bad. That's not the point. In fact, the body is good. It's Gnostic to believe that the body is bad. But being a slave to the body, just as being a slave to anything, is bad. Lacking self control will produce an unbridled tongue. Lacking self control will produce passions within us that rage. So, if I am not in control of my passions, then my passions will be in control of me. And this results in suffering for one thing, but it also results in us creating suffering for other people. And in the context and sinning against God. And in the context of marriage, if our will is untrained and we are slaves to our passions, then again within the context of marriage, we will hurt our spouse. The the reason why a wife is not submissive to her husband is because her passions are left unchecked. The reason why a husband is not able to love his wife properly is because his passions are left unchecked. So when someone comes to us and they say, how can I find a spouse? And we say, become the person your spouse needs you to be, in the context of a woman, we're telling her to become someone who's capable of bridling her passions so that she can be submissive to her husband, so that she can not be um not be gossiping about him, not be backbiting towards him, not be attacking him, but be gentle and submissive to him. At the same time, if we're talking to a husband, we're telling him to train himself to be a leader, to learn how to bridle his passions so that he can have the best interests of his wife and their children in view, so that he can lead them in the way of righteousness, and so that he can therefore be the one who is the head of his household. So, lacking self control, I'm getting sorry, I have a spotty connection here. Um let well, we'll just do our best with what we have. Lacking self-control will ultimately mean an unbridled tongue, but it also means that difficult moments in marriage will be made more difficult. When every marriage has seasons and moments that are frustrating. Every marriage has aspects that are imperfect, and every marriage has um, these sort of frustrations that we all have to deal with. But here's the thing, if you are in control of your passions, then you get through those moments together and come closer on the other side. If you're not in control of those passions, then you lengthen out the time that these battles happen, and you cause more conflict and more difficulty and make the situation worse. So it requires self control to hold back from those situations even starting, or to hold back from making those situations worse. For example, it requires self control to hold back from saying something hurtful. Now, not everyone is a total jerk who wants to hurt their spouse, but everyone has moments where they are frustrated with something and they want to say something. And in that moment, what they will say will hurt their spouse. What they will say will be crushing for their spouse. And it takes self control to restrain the passions so that you don't say those things. I recently saw a post on Facebook where the person said, the best way to control your desires is to stop trying to control them. And I said, I could not disagree with you more, because every person on this earth has at least certain desires that are self destructive. And if we are a slave to those desires, then we will go down a path of self destruction. But if we are instead a slave of righteousness and instead seek the way of righteousness, then that obviously will not happen. And we will be able to overcome these things. It often requires self control not to get into fights with your spouse, especially when, here's the truth, every spouse everywhere will eventually start a fight. Every spouse everywhere will eventually start a fight. But if you have self control, you'll realize that you don't have to engage in that fight. I apologize again about my allergies. Um, anyway, so when you realize that when you have self control and you have the ability to not fight back, then you will be able to overcome those desires. Outside of the context of marriage, I even have a friend who um, he's very liberal, and he likes to throw these digs at me and my worldview, and he likes to say things like, well, your beliefs don't belong in the 21st century, you're just like the Muslims in the Middle East. And he throws out these little digs, trying to kind of be a jerk, um and kind of trying to, I guess, bully me into coming around to his way of thinking. But the reason why I'm able to not respond, I could just respond and say, yeah, well, I think your beliefs are stupid too. I think your beliefs are backwards too. But I don't. I respond to those sorts of things with silence. That's not because I don't have a response. It's because what he's saying makes me upset, but I have the self control not to fight. And part of the reason for that is through the work I've done in fasting and prayer. Um, because it requires self control, lots of self control, to know when to speak and when to be silent. And it even requires self control to know when to apologize. That was something Seraphim Hamilton talked about in his video as well. Sometimes a person who speaks out of turn, or says the wrong thing, says something hurtful, and then has the humility to come to you and apologize, that actually may, in some ways, that makes them a more trustworthy person than someone who just never says the wrong thing. Because if you just never say the wrong thing, you could be thinking very negative thoughts about a person and just not saying them. Whereas if you do in fact say the wrong thing, but then apologize for it, you show that you in fact do care about this person. Um, but it requires self-control to apologize, because in general we don't want to apologize. And through fasting and prayer, it helps us to get to that place. People who have no control over their passions have a very difficult time apologizing, or never apologize to others. And be, when we're talking about marriage, be cognizant of that. If you're courting someone and they never apologize, there's always some excuse for the things they do, you should run. Because the thing is that if you marry this person, they will always have an excuse for how they treat you too, and they will never apologize for that. So never marry a person who refuses to apologize for anything, um, and never be that person either. Don't be a person who apologizes for everything. Don't be like kind of the joke about Canadians that they're so nice that they just constantly apologize for things. Don't be that way either, because that can have its own set of issues. But don't be a person who refuses to take accountability for your actions. So, one of my favorite passages in the New Testament, James 4 1 through 3. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your passions that wage war in your members? I know this translation that I put in here says pleasures, but the word is actually desires or passions. Anyway, is not the source your passions that wage war in your members? You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask, and you ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your passions. James 4 1 through 3. So, this is one of my favorite passages with regard to conflict. I use this passage all the time. The point is that the cause of our conflicts is the passions waging war within us. And this is why I never, ever, ever recommend people read the book, The Five Love Languages. That book is totally depraved. It's horrible. Don't don't read it unless you're reading it to refute it. It's wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Because it's saying your passions are good and your spouse needs to meet your passions. You have these needs and you need your love tank filled. That's wrong ideology. We need to wage war with our passions because there's already a war waging within us, and oftentimes if we aren't self-disciplined, part of the reason is because we're not even consciously aware of the war going on in our passions. I mean, just as a personal example, today while I was walking my dog, I kept thinking about a conversation that I had with one of my friends that I was kind of frustrated about how that conversation went. And then when I came home, I was really flustered, really frustrated, and having a difficult time getting ready for this very podcast because in my mind, I was flustered and frustrated and all over the place. Um, and then I took accountability. I took responsibility for that, and I prayed about it, and I let those things go, and got focused for the lesson today because we need to be consciously aware of the desires that are waging war within us, and we need to be training ourselves to have wisdom, discretion, and self control. And well, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but fasting helps with this process. Fasting is a way of actively and consciously making an effort to tame our passions, to bring them under control because we're training the will. It requires the will to say, I have this kind of food here, but I'm going to eat this instead because today is a fast day. That requires an act of the will. Or to say, I'm going to eat nothing at all today because it's a fast day. Again, that requires an act of the will. So, because of that act of the will, the same will that chooses strawberries and spinach instead of steak and eggs is the same will that is going to find a solution in conflict or is going to be able to choose not to give in to sinful desires. And um, this this is not just true of marriage, this is true of all walks of life, but especially within the context of marriage, this is extremely important because, again, marriage is full of opportunities to either give in to our passions in a negative way or to pursue conflict resolution, to pursue peace, to pursue love and mercy and kindness for someone else. And we have to make that choice every single day. Um, So another benefit of fasting, this is the one most frequently discussed by Paul Washer, the evangelical minister, um, and also discussed by another evangelical minister, uh, Janison Franklin, and I don't know anything about him, but he says the discipline of fasting breaks you out of the world's routine, and this is a benefit of fasting. But Paul Washer kind of breaks this down a little bit for us, and I actually think he's quite insightful here. So fasting forces you to confront who you are without the comforts that our modern world gives us. So when I'm tired and I have a headache and I'm a little bit grumpy and hangry and all these things from fasting, I realize how irritable I am. I realize how um how grumpy I can be, how easily frustrated I can be, how impatient I am. All of these things come to the surface, and fasting forces you to fight against those things. But here's the beauty of it is that fasting brings those things to the surface intentionally so that you are ready for it when the fight comes and you're able to have that fight on your terms. So it gets the passions stirred up by hunger, and then when you fight the passions, you're fighting them on your terms. So to put this into in terms of military strategy, it's always better to meet my enemy on my own terms. I don't want, the enemy invading my country if I'm the military strategist and there's an enemy invading my country, I don't want to let them dictate where the battle is going to be or how the battle is going to be fought. I want to dictate this. So, as an example, the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae, that's a famous example. They intentionally used the terrain to mitigate Persia's numerical advantage. The Russians in the Franco-Russian War and in World War II had a strategy of basically victory through retreat. They would retreat and do what's called scorched earth. So they would retreat and leave nothing for the French military or later the German military to steal. They would they would leave taking everything or destroying what they couldn't take. And then as their enemy advanced, what happened was that eventually the harshness of the Russian winter would essentially force their enemy to be cut off from its supply lines because there was simply no way to resupply your troops in the harshness of the Russian winter. And then the Russians, who are used to this kind of winter, are able to launch a more effective attack in the midst of the winter and the harsh conditions. So that was the tactic of the Russian military against Napoleon and against Hitler, and it worked. Um, but Napoleon himself was no stranger to the very strategy I'm talking about. Napoleon famously, one of the reasons he was so successful was very often, despite being vastly outnumbered, what Napoleon would do was he would always figure out where his enemies were weakest, and he would constantly attack them at their weak points, so that despite the fact that his enemies outnumbered him as a matter of fact, as a matter of their whole troop strength, they outnumbered him. But wherever he caused the battle, he would always make sure that he was the one in control of where the battle happened and when it happened, because in doing so, he always was the one with the numerical advantage and strategic advantage. That is, until again, the Russians deprived him of that. And thankfully, Napoleon was defeated. And then at Waterloo, Napoleon met his famous final defeat. But fasting is enables us to confront our enemies of the world, the flesh, and the devil. And fasting draws at least one of those enemies, the flesh, into combat with us, our sinful passions. We are driven into, they are sort of stirred up, and we're able to have combat with them, but we're able to have combat with them in this sort of training capacity because we've set the terms. And so by forcing ourselves to practice fighting the passions, we train our will to oppose the passions when they hit us with a surprise attack. And this is, again, putting it into military terms, this is why you have to go to boot camp and your MOS training before you can go to war, because they want you to be very well trained and very well practiced, so that when things happen that are not under your control, you're ready to respond instead of react. But marriage is a beautiful gift from God, but it is fraught with difficulty. And marriage requires us to learn to forgive one another. Marriage has some very difficult aspects and very difficult seasons. And fasting puts us through difficulties in the here and now, so that we are trained like that soldier training to meet combat. We are trained to be able to meet the difficulties that come to us in marriage. And this is again, I'm just going to stress this is particularly important for husbands, because husbands need to be the ones leading their wives. So they need to be the ones who are especially trained. And that's why Seraphim of Sarov encouraged young women only to ever marry husbands who kept the fasts. Because by marrying a husband who keeps the fast, you're marrying a husband who has trained himself in this way. So so we fast because when the passions become excited in the world around us, we can be confident that we have trained to be disciplined enough to face them and overcome them. um Jesus himself said, when he was asked by the disciples why, so the context of this verse is that there was a man who was demon possessed, and he would throw himself into the fire. And his father came to Jesus, and the apostles weren't able to heal this man. And then Jesus says something interesting to his apostles. He says, and he said to them, this kind of faith can only come forth by prayer and fasting, or comes forth by nothing but prayer and fasting. That's Mark 9:29. So faith itself, um, and the strength of faith can only come through prayer and fasting. Faith requires us to trust and to persevere in that trust of God. And fasting teaches us to curb our passions, so that when our passions are excited and we find it difficult to trust the way that God chooses to run the universe, and we find it difficult to trust God's plan, fasting is there to help us curb these passions and be less distracted in our prayer lives, less um, less sort of directed by our passions, so that we can be able to trust God's will. There's a multitude of benefits, more than I could really discuss here, but I think you see the point that that faith itself can only come through prayer and fasting, and the growth of our faith only comes through prayer and fasting according to Christ himself. So we need to make absolutely sure that we are engaged in our daily prayers and in the fasts, so that we can learn to curb our passions, learn to overcome the things of this world, and be better able and equipped to press forward in faith. And in the same way, faith is actually extremely important in marriage, and having great faith is extremely important in marriage. The married life is a wonderful life. It's a tool that's meant to draw us closer to Jesus Christ and to our relationship with God. But it often requires us to trust in Christ, to have faith that God will work things out in our marriage, to have faith that we're we're praying for our spouse, we're praying for our children. Oftentimes, children make decisions that we don't support. And that we're not thrilled about, and we have to be able to have faith in those situations, because otherwise they will lead us into sin. And so marriage requires us to keep that focus. And when we lose sight of the goal, marriage becomes very difficult. And one example of this can be the wandering eye. It's very difficult for spouses who are in this struggle. It can often be difficult for some people to not have a wandering eye anyway. So it's difficult to we need to maintain faith. Marriage itself takes great faith and faithfulness, both of which are developed only through prayer and fasting. And it's only through prayer and fasting that we can conquer something like the wandering eye. Um, the wandering eye is one of the most painful things that happens in any marriage. And again, this comes back to self discipline, to self control. Fasting helps us build that self discipline, so that if we're lacking in self discipline, then so, when we see someone else who's attractive physically to us, we'll be tempted to have a wandering eye. But if we've disciplined ourselves and learned self control, then we are able to res- respond to that, to overcome those desires. um again, fasting trains the will to resist temptation. If I'm fasting and I can resist the desire to eat a Pop Tart, or resist the desire to eat my macaroni and cheese because it's a fast day, then that in and of itself will make it easier to resist the will to do something sinful. When the will is being actively engaged to resist that which is not sinful, because I'm fasting, so I'm resisting the urge to eat certain things that aren't in and of themselves sinful, then the then I'm restraining myself, so that in those moments of temptation, I'm stronger and more in control of my will to be able to turn away from that temptation. There's the famous meme of the guy who's walking with his girlfriend, and he's sort of very obviously looking at another woman. Don't be the guy in that meme. Um, Not to mention, some people try to say, because I talk about the wandering eye, and some people try to tell me that, well, it's not a big deal. I'm not hurting anybody. Well, Jesus disagrees. He says, "But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." That's from Matthew chapter chapter 5 verse 24. Sorry, chapter 6 verse 24. So Jesus says that the wandering eye is in fact adultery. Um, Now, a lot of people, men in particular, feel that they have no control over their wandering eye. They feel like they just they feel like it's just, you know, um, it just happens. It's like it's just sort of they have no control. But prayer, fasting, and self discipline enable us to take back control of our eyes as well, because it allows us to take control of our will. And once you take control of your will can overcome the habits and temptations of the eye, because Jesus says that it's better to gouge your eyes out than to be lustful. So um, we need to take this seriously. We need to resist these temptations and be strong in the face of them. Um, I also want to stress that the kind of fasting that Christians are called to is particularly helpful. I think even Pharisaical fasting can actually give a lot of the benefits that we talked about, but Jesus calls us to something higher. He says, unless you are more righteous than the Pharisees. So we're not called to the kind of fasting that the Pharisees did, we're called to something even higher. Um, Jesus says in Matthew 6:16 to 18, moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, so that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. So when we fast and choose to be cheerful anyway, we experience a a whole other world of benefits from fasting. See, because um hypocrites can fast and receive a lot of the benefits I've talked about, because in their fasting they can still be using the fast to curb their passions to a degree. But when we fast and choose to be cheerful anyway, we learn that we cannot control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. Fasting forces us to feel discomfort, hopefully mild pain, hopefully mild suffering, um, but we're doing this by choice. And then we're choosing that. Because we're doing it by choice, it's easier to choose to be joyful anyway, to choose to laugh it off and move forward. And in doing so, we learn to endure suffering that we do not choose and meet that with a degree of joy as well. Maintain our joy in that as well. Obviously, there's limits to that. If you're in the middle of a torture chamber and being exposed to the worst things human beings can imagine for one another, you're not going to be um, singing Charlie Brown's Christmas. But but you have to, in order to endure that suffering, you have to realize that you cannot control what happens to you. You can only control how you respond to what happens to you. And fasting and choosing to be joyful while fasting enables you, in those seasons of difficulty that come up in marriage, to choose joy and gladness. There are going to be difficult times in any marriage, and choosing to be joyful in fasting helps prepare us to choose to be joyful through difficult seasons in marriage, and helps us to choose to take delight in our spouse even when things don't all go our way. So even when our spouse doesn't do everything perfectly the way we might want them to, we still choose to rejoice in our relationship with them, rejoice in who they are in this moment. And when you feel neglected, hurt, dejected, when you feel like your spouse isn't filling your love tank or whatever modern pop psychology garbage says, you'll be capable of choosing to be the person you're called to be in the midst of that suffering because you've trained yourself to do that through fasting. And note, we are called to be who we're supposed to be, even when our spouse is not being who they are called to be. So even and again, this is even more important for men than it is for women, because you need to be the leader who demonstrates this to your wife. So even when your spouse isn't being who God calls them to be, who God calls her to be, through fasting and through prayer, you can learn the self discipline. You can train your will so that you can respond as the person God calls you to be. We are never forced to sin. Finally, there's just so many benefits to fasting, and these are just a few, but the most important benefit is that through fasting, through prayer, we learn more to know and love Jesus Christ and more about having a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that, my friends, is the most important aspect of fasting and prayer and everything else we do in the Christian life. And it's through drawing near to Christ that we can have the best possible marriages as well. So, thank you very much for watching. Please share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed.